plus the fact that there was a monetary surplus that was double that of the Rodrigazo, which could have multiplied prices by 12, inflation by 12. We had all the conditions in place for the inflation rate to reach levels ranging between 15,000% and 20,000%. All you have to do is run the numbers, and it's more than enough. Even though, yesterday's inflation figure was 2.3%. What needs to be? Let's say if today inflation is running at around 30%, there's still a long way to go. That is, a lot has been achieved, but there's still more to do. But I want to give you two lines of hope. The first is that monetary policy has a lag that ranges between 24 and 26 months, according to a study conducted at the University of Cordoba. And for those who, with bad intentions in journalism, do the math wrong because they say, no, well, it's already been 20 months, inflation should have ended by now. No, it's from the moment monetary issuance was stopped. Not only did we carry out the largest fiscal adjustment in history, but we also did it in record time. The other day, Toto was saying that at a meeting of the world's finance ministers, the minister from the United Kingdom said he had a fiscal deficit of 5 points of GDP and that he was going to correct 1 point per year, and everyone applauded him. We achieved zero deficit in 1 month. What we hadn't accomplished in 123 years, we achieved in a month. Also, if we lowered taxes by 2.5 points, let me tell you that the real adjustment we made was 7.5 points. That is, we reduced public spending by 30% in real terms, and that really is giving freedom back to the people, because as Rothbard said, the real tax burden was the size of the public sector, and we have reduced public spending by 30% in real terms. Just look at how much freedom we're giving back to the people. But the thing is, that was only a third of the deficit we had. At the central bank, we had twice as much deficit. We had a quasi-fiscal deficit of 10 points of GDP, and it took us 6 months to fix it and bring it down to zero, which is also a great achievement, unlike other intellectually dishonest people who made the previous minister implement the Bonex plan, which later gave us the Corralito, and then the Catras, let's say, they carried out major expropriations. We did all of this while respecting property rights. But what does this mean? Because the other day I was listening to a journalist who is actually an operator, a hitman. And he said, no, well, but then, it's been several months, so inflation should have disappeared by now. Someone should tell that gentleman that, we were only able to stabilize the money supply halfway through last year. So by the middle of next year, or by August of next year, inflation in Argentina will be a bad story that comes to an end. And what also needs to be understood is that inflation is not neutral. It distorts relative prices, it distorts investment, and as we lower the inflation rate and the price signals flow freely and clearly, because inflation, let's say, is to the price system what noise is to communication. The more noise there is, the worse the communication. But it's not because the sender is doing a bad job or the receiver doesn't understand, it's because there's noise. Well, inflation does the same thing to resource allocation. Therefore, as we eliminate inflation, let's say there will be a jump in productivity in the economy as a result of eliminating inflation. Still, it's a one-time effect, once and for all. And the other important news that I think is worth mentioning, another myth we've debunked, is the idea of pass-through, that when you devalue, it automatically goes to prices. We explained the Cantillon effect and all that, but we also understand that we have 90 years of history where People were swindled by the inflation tax and came to see the dollar as an early indicator of what was coming. And for us, the flip side is that the Argentine economy became dollarized to the equivalent of 42% of M2, the largest number since the return of democracy. In other words, there has never been an attack of such magnitude. Even so, the program held up. I mean, just look at how good the program must be. But not only that, but also when you look at the central bank's monetary liabilities, whether non-interest bearing, like the monetary base, or the interest bearing ones at the time, LELIX, LEBAX, LELIX, PAS, various interest bearing instruments, it was a huge number. Just to give you an idea, when Sturzenegger was president of the central bank, that number was $120 billion. Then, with the arrival of the KUKA risk and the destruction that happened in the capital markets back in 2019, when Kirchnerism won, which is why it's still strange that there are people who denied the KUKA risk just to try to force their poor argument from an intellectual standpoint. So tell me, what exactly happens after all of that? When you look at the size of the monetary liabilities from the last part of Guzman's term until we took office, it was a number that fluctuated between $35 billion and $45 billion. In other words, when it reached $45 billion, a devaluation would occur, and that devaluation would cause the liabilities to decrease. From the central bank down to 35 billion, then people would move into interest rates, start doing carry trade, and it would go back up to 45 billion, and the crisis would return. It was a number that fluctuated between 35 and 45 billion dollars. In that sense, one of the things that happens is that, on average, the central bank's liabilities hovered around $40 billion. And we, even though we took measures that were heavily criticized, for example, just imagine if we had left the 20 trillion in LELIX out on the street, today we'd be talking about a catastrophe. But let's say some rather mediocre economists who seem to understand very little spent their time criticizing the measure. But aside from that, they also lack the intellectual honesty to acknowledge that mistake. What appeared to be completely and utterly unbelievable was that it was even possible to surpass that staggering threshold of $35 billion because it would essentially and fundamentally signify destroying the vital working capital within the entire economy. So those who own a business know how hard it is to build up working capital, which is tied to the life cycle of what comes in and what goes out, what you collect and what you pay. In a company, it's the cash people use to carry out transactions. So it was a very hard number to break, because if that floor held during the Kirchner era, clearly it seemed like a real solid floor. Well, the attack we faced over the last 8 months, because let's not forget that all of this started with a National Congress absolutely intent on ousting us, systematically passing laws every week against macroeconomic stability, the attempt to stir up trouble in the streets. In short, various mechanisms through which they constantly tried to sabotage the government. In that sense, basically what's incredible is that the central bank's monetary liabilities today amount to $25 billion. In other words, so much panic was sown among Argentines that they even burned through $10 billion of working capital. And if you adjust for the effect of the increase in reserve requirements, the number probably exceeds $15 billion. That is to say, even in the face of that attack, we are still standing, we won the elections, and we have set out on the path to a greater Argentina. Therefore, given that drop in money demand, the inflation rate should have become completely unanchored, and yet it remained hovering around 2%. So, as money demand recovers and the economy continues to grow, which is also a fact, the inflation rate will plummet. And finally, what remains now is to provide an explanation for economic growth. We have thoroughly detailed and explained the specific economic sectors where Argentina could be fostering and generating this significant growth, and which are also increasingly apparent and clearly evident, because it is already happening right now. But now let's talk about the foundations of long-term growth. And here, basically, we have three engines. The first engine is the Ministry of the Colossus, led by Federico Sturzenegger, which is the Ministry of Deregulation. It should actually be called, well, in private we call it the Ministry of Increasing Returns, but it's a bit too nerdy to call it the Ministry of Increasing Returns. So we named it deregulation so people would understand us. But actually the idea behind that ministry is to unleash increasing returns. Increasing returns means that an increase in the productivity of whichever factor you're looking at. If you remember, I started the presentation talking about the hockey stick. That is, per capita GDP remained constant until the year 1800, and from 1800 onward, per capita GDP increased 15-fold, in a context where the population increased tenfold. In other words, the world's GDP multiplied by 150 times. So the point is that if I had increasing returns, if the population multiplied by 10, GDP should have multiplied by 10 as well. Well, if it increased 150 times, those are increasing returns. That is, production rose much more than proportionally. In general, in neoclassical theory, that is associated with existence. If I want to get fancy, in terms of general equilibrium terminology, I will talk about non-convexities. If I want to be more intuitive, I would talk in terms of concentrated structures, or to make it even simpler, monopolies, which are a polar case within concentrated structures. And from the perspective of neoclassical economics, that's wrong, and therefore it needs to be regulated. When you regulate monopolies and try to make them behave like competitive firms, the flip side is that by killing increasing returns, you kill economic growth. In that sense, one of the things that happens is that when you look at those countries with the highest regulatory burden, for example, Europe, they are the countries that grow the least in the world. That is to say, when you regulate and kill increasing returns, you are killing economic growth. So in that sense, as we continue to progress further along in the ongoing process of deregulation, we effectively unleash the power of increasing returns, and the economy grows more rapidly. And that's the idea we have at the ministry from a regulatory standpoint. It's interesting because in the last 20 months, we have carried out 10,000 structural reforms. We are certainly unleashing increasing returns. That's why I always say we are the most reformist government in history, and I have no doubt in saying that we are also the best government in Argentina's history. And furthermore, not only have we fulfilled all the promises we made during the campaign, but what we thought would take us 4 years, we accomplished in less than 2. I also want to tell you that one way to honor the support we received at the polls is to continue with our reformist agenda, and we will keep on deregulating and carrying out structural reforms, because we will not stop until Argentina is the freest country in the world. The second engine of economic growth let's say, is just because I'm following the order of the presentation, not because, let's say, it's weighted differently, because in terms of cash flow, it's the one we prioritized from day one. There was no money for anyone except for Minister Petovelo. I have witnesses here who can confirm this. But it's human capital. So where does the idea of human capital come from? Back in 1956, two economists separately, one Robert Solow and on the other hand Trevor Swan, developed a growth model called the neoclassical economic growth model. The model was a total sensation, and the following year, Robert Solow went and tested it empirically. When he tried to explain economic growth with that model, which was very elegant mathematically, what was the problem? That it only explained 15%. The tool was very nice, but it explained nothing. So when you look at it in that specific context, one of the main things to consider is that happened was that the response from the University of Chicago, whose economics department was run by George Stigler, said, your problem is that you don't take human capital into account. And there at the University of Chicago, two schools of thought on human capital were born. One, which is the most well-known, is the micro approach, which is Gary Becker's. Everything related to Gary Becker and human capital. Look at the tribute we paid to Gary Becker. We even named a ministry Human Capital. And on the other hand, the macro version of human capital, it was led by Hirofumi Usawa, who was Japanese, and he supervised the doctoral thesis of Miguel Sidorovsky, who is probably one of the 5 greatest economists in Argentine history. So you can see how closely the topic of human capital is connected to us. However, when it comes to academia, instead of positioning itself according to this approach of Usawa, and instead of looking at human capital from a 2-sector growth model, they decided to go with the idea of technological progress. And technological progress was determined arbitrarily. That is, economic growth ended up being explained arbitrarily. There's actually a very funny anecdote, because I remember, I wasn't there, but I have no reason not to believe those who told the story at a meeting of the Argentine Association of Political Economy. An economist refutes another by saying, no, well, but that's arbitrary. And the other replies, well, but, you know, at MIT they do it that way too, he says. He says, well, but the finger is Samuelson's. It's a slightly more qualified finger. But beyond the joke, the literature decided to go in that direction. And that's why the literature on this topic practically disappeared until Robert Lucas Jr. appeared, who, after finishing his contributions on rational expectations, began to focus on issues of economic growth. And in 1983, Paul Romeu appeared, who in his doctoral thesis developed the theory of endogenous growth. At that point, there was a strong expansion of everything related to endogenous growth theory. And that debate was practically settled in 1989 with a paper by Gregory Mankiw, David Romer, not Paul Romer, David Romer, and David Weil. What they do is empirically test the hypothesis with human capital, and they go on to explain 85% of economic growth. That is to say, they conclude, well, the debate is over. Economic growth is human capital. Human capital has 2 dimensions. There is first-generation human capital and second-generation human capital. First-generation human capital has to do with children's nutrition and with children's health. If you look at our Ministry of Human Capital, one of the very important things it has is everything related to childhood and family, which is providing support to children when they arrive. That is, whether it's the 1,000 days plan, for example, or the fact that the universal child allowance was doubled in real terms. But we also did something that people said was impossible, which was putting an end to the poverty managers. A lot had to be done to put an end to that. And that is further supported and complemented by the various initiatives and strategic actions of the Ministry of Health. Now, second-generation human capital is fundamentally connected to and focused on the critical area of education. We are also working very hard at all levels of the education system, but in order to successfully get there, young children first need to be exceptionally well prepared, physically healthy, and mentally ready for the challenges ahead. But we are also developing and implementing a new literacy program. And we are also working on a comprehensive series of systemic reforms to ensure that education is positioned at the very forefront of our priorities. But even with all that, it's not enough. That's why within human capital, we also have the Secretariat of Labor, and together with the Ministry of Economy and the Ministry of Deregulation, they are the ones designing the labor reform. I want to make a side note again about the lying journalists. The lying journalists are working in favor of those who do not want the reforms to happen. And for at least 15 days now, all they have been doing is undermining this reform, which, by the way, I should mention that in yesterday's cabinet meeting, they were coordinating the work between Toto Caputo's Ministry of Economy, Sturzenegger's Ministry of Deregulation, and Sandra Petrovelo's Ministry of Human Capital. Let's say Sandra couldn't attend the meeting, but Cordero is handling this. In other words, they're really fine-tuning it, putting the finishing touches on it. And it's incredible because the journalists have all these criticisms. Don't let yourselves be manipulated by those liars. Everyone who has read or is writing about the reform, they're all operatives, they're all hitmen. Because I'm telling you, and I have you here as witnesses besides the cabinet, that yesterday the reconciliation was finalized and now the work is with the legal and technical team to harmonize the three proposals. In other words, meanwhile, the media spent all their time talking about all of this. So everyone who listened, all the journalists who were talking about this, they all lied. I mean, just so you know what you're dealing with on the other side. But not only that, but there are also people who were left out of the system, and we are working on the reintegration and re-entry into the labor market of those who were excluded from the system. Therefore, not only are we actively transforming the underlying conditions so that people can cultivate their own personal potential and meaningfully contribute to the overall growth of the economy, but also we are working on labor market conditions so that those who are outside the system can re-enter, and so that going forward they can also be much more productive. And finally, furthermore, the other major initiative that we are currently focusing our efforts on is the complex area of international trade and global commerce. What we're doing is working to make the Argentine economy more open, because economies that are more open are more productive and wealthier. And the best example is that today the bilateral agreement with the United States was finalized, even though the doomsayers said nothing would come of it. And now comes the bonus track. Leave it, it's fine where it is. But all jokes aside for a moment, the bonus track is what's coming in terms of artificial intelligence. The idea of the hockey stick, Adam Smith was the first to see it, let's say, in his second book. The first was The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and the second, let's say, is an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Part 4 is basically a growth model, and the idea of the pin factory is the idea of increasing returns, right? In other words, a single person can only produce 20 pins. If you basically go and divide the task into 15 parts, per capita production jumps to 5,000. That is, they go on to produce 75,000 pins, right? In other words, the idea of increasing returns. Well, and whose limit is set by the size of the market. That is, you will gain productivity by dividing labor if there is demand on the other side, right? That said, artificial intelligence would be like the pin factory of the 21st century. And what that could do is accelerate the process of growth and convergence. For example, we say that if we stay on this course, in 10 years we'll be like Spain, in 20 years we'll be like Germany, in 30 years like the United States, and in 40 years we'll be the world's leading power. However, with artificial intelligence, we could resemble Spain in 5 years, Germany in 10 years, the United States in 15, and become the world's leading power in 20 years. Therefore, that's why we're making such a strong bet on artificial intelligence, while on the other side there are the caveman stone throwers who want to regulate it to the point of killing it before it's even born, which is very typical of the Quinceañistas. For this reason, the process of creating a summary of everything we've said, well, in my mind, because I'm not going to repeat it all again, I'm not going to repeat the conference, in what we were doing in terms of by ensuring a steady cash flow that is effectively enabling the entire economy and allowing various agents to fully express themselves through new investment projects while simultaneously lowering taxes, reducing interest rates, and significantly boosting overall economic growth. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that after everything that happened on October 26th, Argentina will truly be great once again. Thank you very much.
With this, we bid a respectful farewell to the distinguished President of the nation and bring to an official and formal conclusion the 12th Annual Regional Economy Congress.